On a seemingly ordinary evening, Ava Johnson steps into Lumière, a restaurant where every dish is a masterpiece. Yet, it's not just the culinary artistry that will be on trial. It's the unspoken prejudices lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be exposed. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Ava Johnson leaned back in her chair, her fingers gliding over the keys of her laptop as she skimmed the flood of emails in her inbox. The hustle and bustle of the city echoed faintly outside her window, but inside her apartment, all was calm. She had become accustomed to the rhythm of her life as a food critic, discerning, thoughtful, and always on the lookout for the next story or dish that would stir her readers. As her eyes scanned the screen, a particular subject line caught her attention: invitation to review Lumière, a new culinary experience. The name of the restaurant was instantly recognizable. It was the latest in a line of high-end establishments that had created a buzz in the food scene. It promised an experience of opulence, boasting a famous chef who had garnered a reputation for blending traditional techniques with innovative flair. Gourmet Life magazine, the prestigious publication for which Ava freelanced, had specifically requested her for the review. She smiled, knowing this wasn't just any assignment. This was an opportunity to review a restaurant that prided itself on exclusivity and sophistication, all while remaining incognito. As a black woman who had carved out a successful career in a field still dominated by men, and mostly white men at that, Ava had faced her fair share of challenges. Her rise as a critic had been a quiet but determined march toward the top, driven by an unwavering love for food and an equal passion for writing. She was well aware that her mere presence in certain spaces, exclusive restaurants, five-star hotels, and upper-crust social gatherings, often led to subtle yet painful reminders of the assumptions people made about her. Nevertheless, she had long learned to rise above such moments. Ava didn't just critique food. She scrutinized the entire dining experience, from the ambiance and presentation to the nuances of the service. And she had seen it all. Restaurants that offered seamless hospitality and others that failed miserably, often due to the biases of their staff. But no matter what she encountered, she maintained her composure and professionalism. The power of her words, once published, would speak louder than any confrontation. The invitation had piqued her curiosity, especially since Lumière had recently gained notoriety for its cutting-edge cuisine. Diners raved about the artistry on the plate, but the restaurant also had a reputation for catering to a very particular clientele: affluent, refined, and often indifferent to diversity. Ava wondered whether her experience would differ from those of other diners. Regardless, she was determined to evaluate the restaurant on her terms, with a sharp eye and an open mind. On the night of her reservation, Ava dressed with deliberate care. She chose a sleek, simple outfit that blended sophistication with comfort: dark jeans, a tailored blazer, and a pair of modest heels. Her look was elegant but not overdone, signaling that she belonged but didn't need to flaunt it. As she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror before leaving, she felt a wave of both anticipation and resolve. She'd been here before, in these upscale settings, where subtle prejudices sometimes bubbled beneath the surface. But tonight, she reminded herself, she was in control of the narrative. No assumptions would dictate how she experienced the evening. As her cab pulled up to Lumière's entrance, Ava took in the restaurant's facade, a sleek, modern design with floor-to-ceiling windows and soft golden lighting that bathed the space in a luxurious glow. She stepped out and walked toward the entrance, the gentle hum of conversation from inside already audible. The hostess greeted her with a polite smile, checking her reservation. "Good evening. Welcome to Lumière. Do you have a reservation?" "I do," Ava responded, maintaining her calm composure. She glanced around at the other guests being ushered in, their attire signaling wealth and exclusivity. Some were dressed to the nines, while others carried a more casual luxury, the kind that spoke of old money and privilege. The hostess confirmed Ava's reservation and called for a waiter to escort her to her table. That was when Ava first laid eyes on Mark. Mark was in his mid-20s, eager and ambitious, with an air of confidence that came from working in a high-end establishment like Lumière. He had been with the restaurant for nearly a year and had his sights set on advancing in the industry. Mark prided himself on reading people, on knowing who could afford to drop hundreds if not thousands on a meal without blinking an eye. He had learned to gauge his tips based on first impressions, and whether consciously or not, he often treated diners accordingly. When he saw Ava, something in his demeanor shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't an obvious disdain, but there was a coolness, a subtle undercurrent that Ava had come to recognize over the years. She wasn't the kind of customer he expected to serve at Lumière, at least not in his preconceived notions of what the restaurant's clientele should look like. With a half-hearted smile, Mark greeted her. "Right this way, please." As they wove through the dimly lit, artfully arranged tables, Ava took in the restaurant's ambiance. It was undoubtedly impressive, minimalist yet chic, with polished wooden floors, candlelit tables, and an open kitchen where the chefs worked meticulously under soft spotlights. The aromas that drifted through the space were intoxicating, a blend of fresh herbs, slow-roasted meats, and the delicate sweetness of caramelized fruits. But instead of leading her to one of the more coveted tables by the windows, where the view of the courtyard was picturesque, Mark directed her to a table tucked near the back, close to the kitchen doors. It wasn't the worst table, but it was clear that it wasn't prime seating either. Ava remained silent as she sat down. Her years of experience had taught her when to speak and when to observe. And tonight, she was here to observe. As she glanced around, she couldn't help but notice the differences in the treatment of other diners. The well-dressed couple 2 tables away were being pampered by their waiter, who offered wine pairings and recommendations with enthusiasm. Meanwhile, Mark's interaction with her had been clipped, almost rushed. She wasn't offended yet. She was still gathering data, still assessing the experience as a whole. But Ava's intuition told her that this might not just be about a busy night or an overworked waiter. She had seen this before, this quiet, unspoken assumption that someone like her didn't belong in a place like this. As Mark handed her the menu, his expression neutral, Ava decided to play along for now. She would give him the benefit of the doubt for the moment. "Do you have any recommendations?" she asked politely, scanning the intricately designed menu with its array of French-inspired dishes. Mark barely glanced at it. "The house salad is quite popular. Or the grilled chicken, if you're looking for something light." Ava raised an eyebrow. She could tell by his tone that he hadn't even considered suggesting the more extravagant dishes, the ones that Lumière was known for. But instead of challenging him, she simply smiled and nodded. "I'll think about it. Thank you." As he walked away, Ava felt a familiar weight settle in her chest, the weight of someone being seen but not seen, judged without words. But she had learned long ago not to let it consume her. Tonight was about more than just her experience. It was about a restaurant's reputation. And in the end, the power lay in her words. She settled back in her chair, ready to see how the night would unfold. Ava sat quietly at her table, her fingers gently tracing the rim of the glass of water that Mark had set down without a word. The restaurant bustled around her, the soft hum of conversation mixing with the faint clinks of silverware and glasses. Yet, in her corner near the kitchen, it felt strangely detached, as if she were observing from a distance rather than being a part of the dining experience. It wasn't unusual for her to feel this way in certain spaces, especially ones like this, spaces that demanded exclusivity and wore their affluence like a badge of honor. She watched as waiters danced between tables, moving with grace and precision, their arms laden with plates of artistically arranged dishes. The faintest whiff of garlic, thyme, and roasted meats floated in the air, tempting the senses and promising a meal that was designed to impress. Yet here she was, sitting in the shadows, out of the spotlight. Ava couldn't ignore the stark difference in treatment between her and the other diners. Her gaze followed Mark as he attended to a nearby table, a group of well-dressed men and women, their laughter echoing softly through the space. Mark was attentive, leaning in to explain the menu with passion, suggesting wine pairings with an expertise that was completely absent during his interaction with her. She turned back to her own menu, her fingers flipping through the pages as she absorbed the elegant descriptions of each dish. The offerings were undoubtedly impressive, showcasing the chef's talent and creativity. Ava had been excited about this review, eager to see if the restaurant could live up to its lofty reputation. But now, sitting in this forgotten corner of the restaurant, she found her enthusiasm dimming. She pressed her lips together, thinking back to how smoothly the evening could have gone. She had entered the restaurant with an open mind, ready to experience the culinary mastery Lumière promised. But it had taken no more than a few moments for her to sense the undercurrent of prejudice in Mark's behavior, the assumption that she didn't belong, that she wasn't worth his time or attention. Prejudice wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it came in the form of neglect or indifference. It was in the way Mark had rushed her to the back of the restaurant, without even the pretense of offering her a choice of seating. It was in his dismissive tone when recommending the house salad, as if he had already decided she wouldn't be interested in anything more sophisticated. It was in his lack of effort, the way he seemed determined to give her the bare minimum of service because he didn't believe she was worthy of more. Ava's internal dialogue was calm, thoughtful. She had encountered this type of behavior before, many times in fact. Yet it always carried the same sting no matter how many times she faced it. She had learned to compartmentalize, to put her emotions aside when necessary, especially in professional settings. After all, as a food critic, she was here to do a job. Her task wasn't to challenge the biases of every waiter she encountered, but to observe, document, and review. Still, that didn't mean she would ignore what was happening. Ava had long decided that her reviews would always reflect the truth, not just of the food, but of the entire dining experience. And tonight, the experience was tainted by Mark's treatment of her. She could already imagine the lines forming in her mind, the subtle yet powerful words that would reveal the disparity in service without needing to outright accuse the restaurant of discrimination. Her reviews had the power to sway public opinion, to highlight excellence, and to expose shortcomings. And in this moment, she knew exactly what would make its way into her write-up. As she waited for Mark to return, she took another look around the room. The affluent couple seated by the windows were being treated like royalty, their waiter hovering nearby, ready to refill their wine glasses the moment they were half empty. The manager even passed by their table, offering a warm smile and a few words of appreciation for their patronage. It was clear that these guests were being prioritized. Meanwhile, Ava sat with an empty glass and no sign of Mark. He had disappeared again, likely tending to the other tables he deemed more deserving of his attention. Ava knew better than to take it personally. Yet, there was an undeniable frustration that simmered beneath her calm exterior. She had been waiting far longer than any guest should in a restaurant of this caliber, and the delay only served to heighten her awareness of the bias at play. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark reappeared, his expression still indifferent. He set a small plate of bread in front of her without comment, not even bothering to ask if she needed anything else. Ava observed him silently, her thoughts racing. She could see through him. His impatience, his unwillingness to engage, his subtle contempt. He believed she didn't belong here, that much was clear. Whether it was because of her appearance, her casual yet stylish outfit, or something deeper, Ava couldn't say for sure. But it was obvious that he had made up his mind about her the moment she walked through the door. "Are you ready to order?" Mark asked, his voice flat. Ava glanced up at him, her face composed. She could feel the weight of the moment, the choice she had to make. She could call him out, ask him why he was treating her this way, but that wasn't her style. Ava had always believed in the power of subtlety, of quiet strength. She would let her review do the talking. "I'd like to start with the foie gras," she said calmly, watching his reaction. For the briefest moment, Mark's eyes flickered with surprise. It was clear he hadn't expected her to order one of the more expensive starters. But just as quickly as the surprise came, it was replaced by his usual indifference. "And for the main course?" "I'll have the filet mignon, medium rare, with the truffle mashed potatoes," she replied, her voice steady. Mark scribbled down the order without a word and walked away, his posture stiff. Ava leaned back in her chair, exhaling softly. It was a small victory, perhaps insignificant in the grand scheme of things, But it was hers. She had asserted herself in a way that didn't involve confrontation or drama. She had simply made her presence known, and now it was Mark's turn to process that. As the minutes ticked by, Ava's mind wandered, thinking about the countless times she had encountered similar situations. The stares, the assumptions, the microaggressions, they had become a part of her reality in spaces like this. It was exhausting, but she refused to let it deter her from enjoying life or pursuing her passions. She had earned her place at this table, just as much as anyone else, and no waiter's prejudice would take that away from her. When Mark returned with her foie gras, he placed the plate in front of her with a barely concealed grimace. Ava couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. Did he realize how transparent his behavior was, or did he believe that she was oblivious, that his actions were subtle enough to go unnoticed? Ava picked up her fork and knife, slicing into the dish with practiced elegance. The foie gras was exquisite, perfectly seared, rich, and buttery. It melted on her tongue, a testament to the chef's skill. Despite the poor service, the food was living up to the restaurant's reputation, and Ava knew she would give credit where it was due in her review. But service was just as important as the food, and Mark's treatment of her would not go unnoticed. As she savored each bite, Ava began to mentally compose her review, her mind weaving together the elements of the evening, the ambiance, the flavors, the service. It was all part of the story she would tell, a story that would reflect not only her personal experience but the larger issue at play. Prejudice in fine dining wasn't new. It had existed for as long as these exclusive spaces had been built. And Ava, as a food critic and a black woman, had a unique perspective that allowed her to shed light on this often hidden reality. She knew her voice carried weight, and she intended to use it. For now, though, she would continue to enjoy her meal, knowing that the true power of the evening lay not in the hands of Mark or the restaurant, but in her words. The words that would soon follow in the pages of Gourmet Life magazine. The tension that had begun as a quiet undercurrent now swelled into something more tangible, lingering in the air between Ava and Mark. As Ava sat waiting for her main course, she could feel the weight of the evening pressing down on her. It was as if the restaurant itself was silently conspiring to make her invisible. Mark had already made it clear through his dismissive demeanor that he didn't think she belonged. But now, as the minutes ticked by without a sign of her food, it became more apparent that this wasn't just a case of a busy night. It was something deliberate. Ava's patience was wearing thin, though she remained outwardly composed. Years of navigating spaces where she was seen as an outsider had taught her the value of self-restraint. She had learned to maintain her poise, even when every part of her wanted to react. But that didn't mean she was unaffected. Far from it. Each passing minute, without a refill on her water, without a check-in from Mark, chipped away at the veneer of professionalism she wore like armor. She wasn't just a food critic tonight, she was a customer, and she was being disrespected. A loud burst of laughter caught her attention. The affluent group seated by the windows was in high spirits, their table littered with empty plates and half-full glasses of expensive wine. Mark hovered around them like a shadow, refilling their glasses with eager precision, offering smiles and engaging in light conversation. It was the kind of service she had expected when she walked into Lumière, but instead, it was reserved for those whom Mark deemed worthy of his time. Ava's gaze followed him as he weaved between tables, expertly balancing trays of gourmet dishes and wine bottles. He hadn't looked in her direction once in the last 20 minutes. Her own table, meanwhile, remained conspicuously unattended. She felt an undeniable surge of frustration, but still, she waited. Her job required observation. Patience was essential in capturing the full picture of a dining experience. Ava wasn't one to jump to conclusions or let her emotions cloud her judgment. But tonight, she knew what she was seeing, and it was a reality she had faced more times than she cared to admit. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mark returned. He carried her main course, a beautifully plated filet mignon, but there was something off in the way he set it down. There was no flourish, no attempt at the kind of presentation one would expect from a restaurant of this caliber. It was almost as though he had tossed it onto the table. Ava glanced at the dish, The food looked fine, but it was the attitude that marred the experience. She glanced up at Mark, her expression calm but inquisitive. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft yet firm. Mark didn't reply. He merely nodded curtly and turned to leave again. "Mark?" Ava called after him, her tone polite but unmistakably sharp. He paused, stiffening slightly before turning back to face her. "Yes?" Ava took a breath, maintaining her composure. "Is there a reason why the service has been different for me than for the other tables?" Mark blinked, clearly caught off guard by her directness. For a brief moment his mask of indifference slipped, revealing a flicker of discomfort. But he quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "I'm not sure what you mean," he replied, his voice as flat as it had been all evening. Ava raised an eyebrow. "I think you do. I've been waiting far longer than necessary for my food, and I've noticed that you've been much more attentive to the other guests. Is there something about me that makes you think I'm less deserving of the same level of service?" Her words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Mark's face flushed slightly, and he shifted his stance, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to speak up. He was used to customers either accepting the poor service silently or leaving without a fuss. But here was Ava, poised and unflinching, calling him out in the most polite yet direct way possible. "I apologize if you feel that way," he said, his voice strained. "It wasn't intentional." Ava smiled, though there was no warmth behind it. "Intentional or not, it's been noticed. I'd like to enjoy the rest of my meal without any further issues, if you don't mind." Mark nodded quickly, his face tight with barely concealed irritation. "Of course," he muttered before walking away, his steps more hurried than before. Ava watched him go, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. She knew that this wasn't over, that her speaking up had rattled him, but it wouldn't change the underlying issue. People like Mark didn't just shed their prejudices because of one confrontation. It was deeper than that, woven into the very fabric of his assumptions about who belonged in places like this. She turned her attention back to her food. The filet mignon was perfectly cooked, tender and flavorful, just as she had hoped it would be. But the experience was tainted now, colored by the blatant disparity in service. No matter how exquisite the food was, it couldn't erase the way she had been made to feel invisible, unimportant. As she ate, her mind raced. She thought about the countless other diners who had likely experienced the same treatment in restaurants like Lumière. How many had stayed silent, accepting their poor treatment as just another part of life? How many had walked away feeling diminished, questioning whether they truly belonged in spaces that claimed to offer luxury for all? Ava had seen it too many times, and tonight was just another reminder of the work that still needed to be done. As the evening wore on, the restaurant began to quiet down, the once bustling tables now clearing out as patrons finished their meals. Ava noticed Mark lingering near the entrance, his posture tense. She could see that he was avoiding her, hoping to make it through the rest of the evening without another interaction. But Ava wasn't done yet. When her dessert arrived, a delicate chocolate soufflé, Ava decided to enjoy it fully, savoring each bite despite the sourness that the service had left behind. The dessert was a masterpiece, the kind that would have earned a glowing review in any other circumstance. But Ava knew that her review wouldn't just focus on the food. It never did. The service, the atmosphere, the way a restaurant made a diner feel, it was all part of the experience. And tonight that experience had been marred by prejudice. As she finished her dessert, she signaled for the check. Mark, to his credit, approached quickly this time, though his demeanor remained stiff and formal. "Here's your check, ma'am," he said, placing the bill on the table without meeting her eyes. Ava reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet, her movements deliberate. She placed her credit card on top of the bill, along with something else, a business card. Mark glanced down at the table, his eyes widening slightly as he read the small piece of cardstock that lay next to her credit card. Ava Johnson, Food Critic, Gourmet Life magazine. For a moment, Mark was frozen, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning realization. He had no idea that the woman he had dismissed and treated with such indifference was, in fact, someone who held the power to shape the very reputation of the restaurant he worked for. Ava gave him a small, knowing smile, her eyes never leaving his. "Thank you for your service, Mark," she said, her voice smooth and calm, though the words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Mark stammered, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Ah, thank you, ma'am, I didn't realize." Ava held up a hand, silencing him. "It's fine," she said simply. "I've seen enough." With that, she stood, gathering her coat and bag. She left the business card on the table, a silent message that needed no further explanation. As she made her way toward the exit, Mark remained standing there, staring at the card as if it held his fate in its delicate script. As Ava stepped outside into the cool night air, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The night hadn't gone as she had hoped, but it had gone as she had expected. And now the real work would begin. Her words would tell the story that needed to be told, and she knew that they would carry weight. Not just for Mark, but for anyone who thought that their assumptions could go unchecked in a world that was slowly, but surely, changing. The cool evening air outside Lumière offered a brief respite from the tension inside the restaurant, but Ava could feel the weight of the night still lingering in her mind. As she walked down the street, her steps steady and purposeful, she knew that the events of the evening were far from over. Mark's reaction, the shock that spread across his face when he realized who she was, it had been almost predictable. She had seen that look before in others. It was the look of someone who had made a mistake they couldn't take back, who realized too late the power they had underestimated. As Ava hailed a cab, her mind replayed the moments from earlier in the evening. Mark's subtle indifference, the way he had dismissed her, the delay in service. All of it now seemed to culminate in the single moment when he read her business card. It was a moment that had shifted the balance of power, and while Ava felt a sense of justice in that, she also knew it was a moment that carried implications beyond her personal experience. A short ride later, she arrived at her apartment. Once inside, she set down her bag and let out a long breath, as though releasing the emotions she had held in check all night. The comfort of her home surrounded her, a space where she could finally let down her guard. She removed her coat, hung it carefully, and then sat down at her kitchen table, where her laptop rested. The night was far from over. There was still work to be done. Ava opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys for a moment before she began typing. The review she would write tonight was not just about the food. Yes, the chef at Lumière had done an impressive job, and the dishes themselves had been a testament to culinary artistry. But that was only part of the story. The real story was in the way she had been treated, in the service that had been tainted by subtle prejudice and bias. And that was a story she needed to tell, not just for herself, but for anyone else who had walked into spaces like Lumière and felt that same sting of invisibility. Her review began with an elegant description of the restaurant's ambiance, the soft lighting and modern decor that exuded luxury. She wrote about the impeccable presentation of the dishes, the balance of flavors, and the technical skill behind each course. But then, as the paragraphs unfolded, Ava shifted her tone. She began to detail the service, the way Mark had treated her differently from the moment she walked through the door, how his assumptions about her had colored the entire evening. She wasn't vindictive in her writing. That wasn't her style. Instead, she used precision, noting the facts without embellishment. The truth, she knew, was enough to expose the deeper issue. As she typed, she thought about how important it was to strike the right balance. She didn't want her review to be seen as a personal vendetta against Mark. It was bigger than him. It was about a system of assumptions, about the way people like her were often treated when they entered spaces that were designed to cater to a particular type of clientele. Her words would serve as a mirror, reflecting not just the service she had received, but the unspoken barriers that existed in high-end dining establishments. When she finished the first draft, Ava leaned back in her chair, reading over what she had written. She knew the review would make waves, and that was exactly what it needed to do. There was no place for prejudice in spaces that prided themselves on luxury and hospitality. Her job as a critic wasn't just to assess the quality of the food, it was to assess the entire experience, and tonight that experience had been marred by bias. The next morning, Ava sent her review to the editor at Gourmet Life magazine, her heart steady with the knowledge that she had done the right thing. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking accountability. And as she sent the email, she knew that the consequences of her words would ripple through Lumière, through its staff, and most certainly through Mark. Meanwhile, back at Lumière, the mood was starkly different. It was late, and the restaurant had closed for the night. The dining room, once filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses, was now silent. Catherine, the restaurant's manager, sat in her office at the back, going over the day's receipts and reservations. She had sensed a tension earlier that evening, though she hadn't been able to place exactly where it was coming from. But now, as the evening's events began to settle in her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. Her suspicions were confirmed when Mark knocked on the door of her office. "Come in," she called, not looking up from her computer. Mark stepped into the room, his face pale, his usual confident demeanor noticeably absent. He fidgeted with the hem of his apron as he stood awkwardly in the doorway. Catherine glanced up and immediately noticed his discomfort. "What is it, Mark? Did something happen tonight?" Mark hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I think I made a mistake," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine's brow furrowed. "What kind of mistake?" Mark walked farther into the room and handed her a small business card. Catherine took it, her eyes scanning the words that were printed neatly on the front. Ava Johnson, food critic, Gourmet Life magazine. For a moment, Catherine didn't speak. She simply stared at the card, processing the implications. When she finally looked up at Mark, her expression was unreadable. "You're telling me that Ava Johnson, one of the most respected food critics in the industry, was here tonight, and you didn't recognize her?" Catherine's voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it. Mark swallowed hard, nodding. "I didn't know. I swear, I had no idea who she was." Catherine leaned back in her chair, letting out a long sigh. "Tell me exactly what happened, Mark." He hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable, but he knew there was no way around it. Slowly, he recounted the events of the evening. How he had seated Ava near the back, how he had been less attentive to her table, how he had assumed she wasn't the type of guest who required the same level of service as the others. As he spoke, Catherine's expression darkened. When he finished, there was a long silence between them. "Mark," Catherine said slowly, her voice low, "do you understand what you've done?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "I didn't mean to treat her differently. I didn't think she was." "You didn't think she was what?" Catherine interrupted, her tone sharp. "That she was important? That she deserved the same service as everyone else?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He knew there was nothing he could say that would make this right. Catherine rubbed her temples, clearly frustrated. "This is exactly the kind of behavior we can't afford in this restaurant. Lumière prides itself on providing an exceptional experience for every guest, regardless of who they are. And you just undermine that." Mark's heart sank. He knew what was coming next. He had made a terrible mistake, and there was no way to undo it. All he could do was wait for the consequences to fall. Catherine stood up, her voice calmer now, but no less stern. "Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow, I'm going to reach out to Miss Johnson and offer our sincerest apologies. We'll do everything we can to make amends. But as for you," she paused, her eyes locking onto his. "You're done here, Mark. I can't keep someone on staff who doesn't understand the basic principles of respect and hospitality. You're fired." Mark's face turned a deep shade of red. He had expected this, but the reality of it still hit hard. Without another word, he nodded and left the office, his mind swirling with regret. The following morning, as Catherine sat at her desk, she drafted a carefully worded email to Ava. She knew that the damage had already been done, but she hoped that a sincere apology could at least mitigate some of the fallout. She also knew that Ava's review, once published, could make or break the restaurant's reputation. Lumière had been riding high on its success, but one bad review from a critic as influential as Ava could send it spiraling into controversy. Catherine's email was respectful, acknowledging the poor service Ava had received and offering to make things right. She ended the email with a personal note, expressing her hope that they could move forward and that Lumière would be given another chance to prove itself. But as she hit send, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that no amount of damage control could undo what had already been set in motion. Prejudice, once exposed, had a way of unraveling even the most carefully constructed facades. Back in her apartment, Ava read the email from Catherine with a quiet sense of satisfaction. She appreciated the gesture, but she knew that words alone weren't enough to fix the systemic issues that had led to her treatment in the first place. It wasn't just about one waiter or one restaurant. It was about the larger patterns of discrimination that existed in spaces like Lumière. Ava sat back, closing her laptop. Her review would be published soon, and the consequences would follow. But for now, she felt a sense of peace. She had done what she could to bring the truth to light, and now it was up to the world to listen. The days following Ava's review submission were a whirlwind of anticipation for both the restaurant and Ava herself. She knew from experience that once the words were out, they would ripple far beyond the pages of the magazine. Reviews in prestigious publications like Gourmet Life magazine had a reach that extended into the industry itself. Chefs, restaurateurs, and patrons alike read them closely, taking note of every critique, every praise, and every subtle nuance. Ava's words had the power to make or break an establishment, and in this case, she knew they would do both. The morning of the review's publication arrived quietly for Ava. She had received a notification from the editor alerting her that the piece had gone live online and would be in the upcoming print issue. She sat at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, her laptop open in front of her. As the article loaded, Ava took a moment to reflect on the previous week's events. The review began with her customary style, describing the restaurant's ambiance, the artistry of the dishes, and the technical brilliance of the chef. She had given credit where it was due, noting that Lumière's food was exceptional, worthy of the accolades it had received. But as the review unfolded, Ava deftly wove in the story of her experience, laying out the facts of her evening without anger or accusation, but with a calm precision that left no room for doubt. She described the disparity in service she had witnessed, the subtle ways in which she had been treated as less than the other diners. She didn't mention Mark by name, but she detailed his actions, how he had seated her in the back, ignored her for long stretches, and only realized his mistake when it was too late. Ava framed the incident as part of a larger issue, a pervasive problem in high-end dining where certain guests were treated with more care and attention simply because of how they looked or what the staff assumed about them. It wasn't a personal attack, but a critique of a system that still had deep flaws. Her words were measured, but their impact was unmistakable. By the time Ava finished reading the article, she knew it would spark conversation, not just about Lumière, but about the industry as a whole. She closed her laptop, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. The truth had been told, and now it was time to let the world react. At Lumière, the fallout from Ava's review was swift and brutal. The morning after the article went live, Catherine sat in her office, her phone ringing off the hook. The restaurant's email inbox was flooded with messages from patrons, reporters, and concerned customers. The review had been shared widely on social media, with many people expressing outrage over the treatment Ava had received. The hashtags Lumière Review and Had Discrimination in Dining began trending, and the restaurant's pristine reputation was now under siege. Catherine, who had always prided herself on running a tight ship, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had read Ava's review the moment it was published, and though she had been bracing for the worst, actually seeing it in print made her stomach turn. The review was damning, not just because it exposed the flaws in the restaurant service, but because it highlighted a broader issue that people were increasingly unwilling to ignore: discrimination in places that marketed themselves as being open to all. As she scanned through the endless stream of emails, Catherine's heart sank further. Regular customers were questioning their loyalty to the restaurant, while new patrons, who had been eager to try Lumière after hearing about its accolades, now hesitated to make reservations. The restaurant had been riding high on its success, But Ava's review had brought it crashing down to reality. Catherine knew that there was no easy way to fix what had happened. An apology to Ava had already been sent, but that wouldn't be enough to repair the damage. The restaurant's reputation had taken a serious hit, and it would take more than words to regain the trust of the public. She sighed deeply and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "How did we let this happen?" she muttered to herself. But in her heart, she knew the answer. Lumière had prided itself on exclusivity, on catering to a certain type of clientele, and in doing so, it had fostered an environment where people like Mark felt justified in their assumptions about who did and didn't belong. Speaking of Mark, his absence in the restaurant was already being felt. He had been a competent, if not overly ambitious, waiter. Catherine had fired him immediately after their tense conversation a few days ago, but the consequences of his actions had outlasted his employment. Other staff members were now on edge, wondering if they too would be scrutinized for their behavior. It was a tense time, and Catherine could feel the pressure mounting from all sides. She knew that things needed to change, and fast. For Mark, the fallout had been even more personal. The day after his firing, he sat alone in his small apartment, the walls feeling like they were closing in on him. He hadn't been able to sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of regret and shame. He had read Ava's review. Of course, every word of it burned into his memory. Though she hadn't named him directly, he knew she was talking about him. He could see it in the way she described the dismissive service, the unspoken assumptions he had made about her. He had been so sure of himself that night, so certain that he knew who she was based on a glance, based on the surface-level details that he had used to make snap judgments about people. But now, in the stark light of the consequences, Mark realized how wrong he had been. It wasn't just that he had lost his job, it was the knowledge that his actions had contributed to something much bigger. A pattern of exclusion and prejudice that he had blindly perpetuated. Mark replayed the night over and over in his head, wondering what he could have done differently. The truth was, he hadn't even considered Ava's feelings that evening. He had been too wrapped up in his own perceptions, his own desire to impress the right kind of people. And now, he was paying the price for that arrogance. As the day wore on, Mark knew he needed to do something. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could at least try to make amends in some way. He drafted a long email to Catherine, apologizing again for his behavior, and asking if she could pass along a message to Ava. In the email to Ava, which he didn't expect to be read, he expressed deep remorse for his actions and acknowledged the harm he had caused. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't think he deserved it. But he wanted Ava to know that her words had made him reflect on himself in a way he hadn't done before. Mark hit send, knowing that the gesture wouldn't erase his mistakes, but it was a step toward taking responsibility. Back at Lumière, Catherine had decided that an overhaul of the restaurant's policies was necessary. She called an emergency staff meeting, where she addressed the issues raised in Ava's review head-on. She spoke openly about the need for change, about how the restaurant had to evolve if it wanted to survive in an increasingly inclusive and socially conscious world. Catherine introduced a mandatory diversity and sensitivity training program for all staff members, not just as a reaction to what had happened, but as a proactive measure to prevent such behavior in the future. The training, Catherine hoped, would open her staff's eyes to the biases they might not even realize they held. But she knew that training alone wouldn't solve everything. It was about changing the culture of the restaurant, about creating an environment where every guest, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived status, was treated with the same level of respect and care. It would take time, she knew. Rebuilding trust always did. But it was a necessary step if Lumière wanted to regain its standing in the industry. For Ava, life moved forward in a steady rhythm. She continued her work as a food critic, reviewing restaurants with the same discerning eye and commitment to fairness. But the events at Lumière had left a lasting impression on her. The reaction to her review had been overwhelming, with countless readers reaching out to thank her for shedding light on an issue that so many had experienced, but few had spoken about publicly. A few days after the review was published, Ava received an email from Catherine. The manager had passed along Mark's message, which Ava read with a mixture of surprise and reflection. She hadn't expected an apology, and while she appreciated the gesture, she wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. People like Mark existed everywhere, and while he had shown some signs of growth, it didn't erase the fact that his behavior had been part of a larger system of exclusion. Still, Ava took a moment to acknowledge his message, sending a brief reply. She didn't offer forgiveness, but she did offer a simple truth. We all have the capacity to learn and do better. I hope you take this experience as an opportunity to grow, not just as a server, but as a person. And with that, Ava felt a sense of closure. She hadn't set out to punish anyone. Her goal had always been to tell the truth. And in doing so, she had sparked change, not just in Lumière, but perhaps in others who read her words and saw a reflection of their own experiences. As the weeks passed, Ava moved on to her next assignment, another review at another restaurant. But she knew that the lessons learned at Lumière would stay with her, and hopefully, with those who had been touched by the story. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.